Good morning, tuberistas. On Sunday evening, April 29th, 2012, 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl interviewed W. Bush's CIA torture-in-chief, Jose Rodriguez. Of course, he whitewashed himself, the agency, and his president, but his inconsistencies and hypocrisies are worth noting at some length. During the interview, in which we saw the face of a torturer close up, something not usually seen in the honest light of day, Rodriguez began his misleading mishmash with, "For the first time in our history, we had an enemy come into our homeland and killed 3,000 people. Well, the fact is that enemies have trespassed on the homeland more than once. The British Army in 1776 and 1812, in the latter case they even burned the capital, and during the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa raided New Mexico. And of course, for its first 200 or so years of organized existence, English North America had an enemy living on its territory, challenging its eminent domain at its very doorstep with blood and terror, at every point of settlement, namely the American Indian. Native Americans were widespread practitioners of torture, but the U.S. government never, even then, sanctioned enhanced interrogation of Cochise or Geronimo. Of course, it practiced extermination, which only shows the greater stupidity, not humanity, of Bush and Rodriguez for leaving broken survivors behind half alive. It's not surprising that Rodriguez was the man chosen for this job, because he got his start in South America in 1976. Remember that this was the era of the Southern Cone dictatorships and Central American death squads, Pinochet in Chile, the colonels of Argentina and Uruguay, Stroessner in Paraguay, Blowtorch Bob D'Aubuisson, death squad leader of El Salvador, Rios Montt, the genocidal general of Guatemala. During these very years, Rodriguez was praised by colleagues as one of the best field operatives in the whole agency, which must have been true, because he was promoted to station chief in 3 countries, including Mexico, and finally director of the whole Latin American division. Considering what the U.S. was up to in assisting these regimes, it would not be surprising to learn that Rodriguez was involved in Operation Condor. That was the agency's coordinated kidnap and torture program, coordinated between the U.S. and South American military intelligence agencies. He was also involved in Iran-Contra, but was careful enough to cover his tracks and escape prosecution. So, in the days after 9/11, he was eager to get his hands dirty again, and Dick and Bush knew they had their hatchet man. During the interview with Leslie Stahl, he said, "We," meaning he, because I claim no association with his deeds, would have blood on our, meaning his hands, because I repudiate any action that he did, if he did not perform surgery on those in his custody. The truth is, there was a bloody trail following this guy already, and you'd better have an AIDS test if you shook hands with him. This time, though, the damn spots would not out. So when Leslie Stahl says he learned these techniques from a former military psychologist who adapted the brutal tactics of our Cold War adversaries into enhanced interrogation techniques, this is egregious nonsense. He learned this from America's Cold War allies, with whom he worked, by being out in the field with them, perhaps even while they were chainsawing nuns to shreds, or disemboweling children, or raping 90-year-old women. This is where Rodriguez is coming from, and being a Puerto Rican native, he would have had access to the most intimate aspects of Latin American black operations. So those of you who think Rodriguez is a great guy and hero for what he did, then you also endorse the rapers of American nuns, and the assassination of Randy Moffett in Washington, D.C. by Chilean military security. That's how the agency helps save American lives. But then it just depends which lives, doesn't it? Apparently some American lives are more worthy than others. And you out there, don't be so sure you're among the worthy. Rodriguez disingenuously said he was concerned about the legality of his actions and insisted everything be authorized so the poor agency wouldn't be left holding the bag again. Well, we know, as per my last video, that Dick and Bush authorized changing or subverting the relevant laws on torture. They didn't need persuasion by Rodriguez to cover their asses for something they wanted to do, nor did Rodriguez ever bother about legality before when it came to his or the agency's actions. Leslie Stahl pressed him on the success of torture in accomplishing its alleged objectives, gathering information on networks, ticking bombs, and the like. The CIA's own Inspector General and the FBI says enhanced interrogation was largely a waste of time, that it was no more productive, even less so, than traditional attempts to gain cooperation. Of course, Rodriguez was having none of this, but then he tried distancing himself from Abu Ghraib, saying that what he was doing was legal, while the likes of Lindy England were psychopaths beyond the law. Well, first of all, Dick and Bush changed the law to justify what had been illegal, and when they couldn't, they overrode the law by executive decree. And in the latter cases, they can still be prosecuted. So Rodriguez's people are in the same boat as Lindy England. Miss England and his cohorts, by the way, were acting under authorization from their military intelligence superiors, exactly as Rodriguez, under the same executive decrees, and have defended themselves under that same pseudo-legality. which is why Rodriguez ordered 92 graphic videos of his interrogations destroyed. Rodriguez also gave the game away when confronted by Miss Dahl for the actions of his own people, mock executions, threatening detainees with power drills, threatening to rape wives and kill children, the whole litany of procedures from Latin America days. Rodriguez dodged this by saying they had no authority to do these things, but excuse me, he said there was legal authority to do whatever it took to gain cooperation from 9/11 related prisoners, that it was time to put on the big boy pants and not get squeamish. There were no lines drawn by Bush and Dick. Agents in the field were given a blank check short of cold-blooded murder to physically and mentally break their prisoners. And that was the true objective here. Not so much to gather information or save lives, but to gratuitously inflict pain and suffering on enemies for the pleasure of it, an expression of absolute power by agencies in the U.S. government who exploited 9/11 to usurp power over civil law and enjoyed using it. When Rodriguez said the program wasn't about hurting anybody, he shows the moral imbecility of all torturers. But let me say this in his defense. The reason many liberals like Miss Dahl so dislike Rodriguez is that he's popped their bubble of American exceptionalism and virtue. I like the nuance of this piece being followed on the same broadcast by one on the family of Leon Trotsky, mentioning how he was murdered in Mexico, Mr. Rodriguez's old headquarters, by one of Stalin's agency men. But Rodriguez shows that there is no congenital moral superiority about Americans, their professed values, or way of life. That it's not who you are or what you believe that counts, but what you really do. Rodriguez showed that, for all of its smug, city-on-a-hill self-righteousness, that when push comes to shove, the United States government will behave no differently than Saddam Hussein or the Gestapo unless the people it rules calls their bullshit. Torturers like Rodriguez did not succeed because the hard cases he dealt with are as committed, and perhaps, as evil as himself. Torture can inflame resistance, not break it. And if it creates helplessness and despair, that will work against the torturer by making his victim willing to die, out of spite if nothing else. That's why those who inflict torture do it only for themselves, and their own dark and evil and perverse gratification, and for no higher purpose. That Dick and Bush expose themselves as moral perverts on the same level as child pornographers should go without saying. Knock upon my phone? Hello? Who? Blowtorch Bob? Hey, how's life in hell? You ought to be right at home. What's that? Pinochet beat you in pinochle in hell. And you're calling for your old buddy Jose Rodriguez to come on down and give you a helping hand. It'd be like old times seeing you all together again, wouldn't it? Hasta la victoria siempre.